Amara walked into the wide hall with slow and careful steps, her heart beating louder than the clicking of her shoes on the polished floor, and she instantly knew she did not belong among the glittering chandeliers, velvet curtains, and heavy perfume of wealth that surrounded her. The air was thick with judgment, and though no one said her name out loud, she could hear the whispers carried through stiff smiles and tilted heads. Why is she here? Who invited her? She has no place among us. She was just a teenager, quiet and uncertain, dressed in a simple black dress that her mother had ironed the night before, while the others wore expensive suits and sparkling jewelry that announced their importance before they even spoke. She tried to sit down quietly, taking a chair at the far end of the long oak table where the family had gathered for the reading of her grandfather's will, but her presence was like a ripple in still water, small, yet impossible to ignore. Every eye turned to her, some in surprise, others in thinly disguised annoyance, and Amara felt the weight of being an outsider pressing harder on her shoulders. She remembered the last time she had seen her grandfather, the gentle way he had touched her hand, the soft smile he had given her, and the words he had whispered, "Be strong, Amara, even when the world doubts you." That memory was the only anchor keeping her seated in the chair when she wanted to run out the door and leave the room filled with sharp glances and hidden laughter. The lawyer sat at the head of the table, arranging papers with practiced calm, but before he could even begin, a woman across the table leaned toward another and muttered something, followed by quiet chuckles that were meant to sting. Amara lowered her eyes to the polished wood, fighting back the heat that rose in her chest, but she could not block out the sound of mockery or the rustle of silk sleeves as people shifted in their chairs, as if her presence was some kind of inconvenience. She thought of how different they all seemed, perfectly confident, speaking in firm voices, wearing watches that probably cost more than her mother's car, and here she was, a girl who barely spoke up in class, now trapped in a room full of people who carried both her bloodline and their disdain. The chandelier above glowed too brightly, making her eyes sting, or perhaps it was the tears she refused to let fall. She reminded herself that she had been invited, that the letter bearing her name was real, that she had every right to be here just as much as the others, but doubt crawled into her mind with each passing second. What if it had been a mistake? What if she had been called here only to be embarrassed in front of everyone? The thought made her throat tighten, but still she sat, clutching her small black purse on her lap, her knuckles white as her grip tightened. Around her, the relatives laughed loudly, their voices carrying the kind of confidence that only comes with the belief that they already knew the outcome, that the will would favor them, that Amara was nothing more than a shadow passing through their shining world. And yet, deep inside her, there was a flicker of something else, something quiet but steady, the same strength her grandfather had seen in her, the same strength that had made him look into her eyes with trust. That flicker kept her from leaving her chair. The suspense in the room grew heavier as the lawyer finally cleared his throat and shuffled the stack of papers, and though the others leaned forward with greedy anticipation, Amara felt her chest tighten, not from greed but from fear of what was about to be revealed. Every second seemed to stretch endlessly, and she sat there, the outsider at the table, holding her breath, waiting for the first words of the will to decide whether she truly belonged or whether every whisper around her was right. The room was silent only for a moment, the kind of silence that carries tension rather than peace, and then it began, the whispers that turned into chuckles, the chuckles that turned into bold remarks made just loud enough for Amara to hear. She sat at the far end of the long table, her shoulders stiff, her fingers tightening around the edge of her chair, while the relatives around her exchanged sly smiles as though her presence was the funniest thing in the world. A man in a gray suit leaned back and said in a mocking tone, "I suppose everyone is welcome here these days," and the woman beside him laughed softly, covering her mouth with a jeweled hand but making sure the sound reached Amara. Another voice muttered, "She won't last long, she'll be gone before the papers are signed," and suddenly the whole table seemed alive with quiet mockery, like snakes hissing in the shadows. Amara could feel the heat rise in her face, her ears burning, her chest tightening as if the walls themselves were pressing closer, but she kept her eyes fixed on the polished wood in front of her, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing her flinch. Still, each word pierced her like a blade, carving into her fragile courage, making her wonder why she had come at all. Her mother had told her to be strong, her grandfather had trusted her enough to invite her into this moment, but in that instant, all of that seemed to fade beneath the weight of their laughter. She thought of how different they all looked, dressed in fine clothing and wearing confidence like a second skin, while she sat in her simple black dress, her hands trembling beneath the table. It was not only the clothes that set her apart, it was the unspoken belief that she was not one of them, that she was only here to watch from the sidelines. The lawyer adjusted his glasses and cleared his throat, perhaps sensing the undercurrent of cruelty in the air, but the relatives did not stop. A woman leaned forward and said to no one in particular, "What a shame, dragging her into this when she won't see a single coin," and though her words were directed at the air, her eyes found Amara's and lingered with sharp disdain. The laughter that followed was quiet, but it was enough to make Amara's throat tighten, enough to make her blink back the sting in her eyes. She wanted to speak, to defend herself, to remind them that her grandfather had loved her, that she had every right to sit at this table, but her voice refused to rise, trapped behind the lump in her throat. She sat silently, her heart hammering, each beat echoing louder than the mocking voices, and in her silence, she found a fragile strength, though it felt more like survival than courage. She remembered sitting with her grandfather in the garden, his hand resting on hers as he told her, "They may doubt you, Amara, but never doubt yourself," and the memory pressed against her heart like a shield, thin but steady. The weight of their mockery was almost unbearable, a storm of sharp words and hidden smiles that tried to push her down, but she held her ground, even if holding her ground only meant staying in her chair and refusing to leave. The lawyer tapped his pen against the papers, finally bringing a hush to the table, and the relatives leaned back, pretending innocence, though the smirk still lingered on their lips. The room seemed to grow colder, the air heavy with greed and scorn, and Amara sat among them, the outsider who bore every cruel word in silence, the one they all believed would leave empty-handed. Yet somewhere beneath the weight of their mockery, deep within her chest, the flicker of her grandfather's faith still burned, quiet but unyielding, and though she did not yet know it, that flame would soon change everything. The lawyer's voice cut through the heavy air, low and steady, and the rustling of papers sounded louder than it should have, as though every word he read carried the weight of fate itself, and the relatives who had been smirking and mocking only moments before leaned forward with greedy anticipation, their eyes shining with the certainty that their names would be called next to vast fortunes and prized possessions. Amara sat rigid in her chair, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her stomach twisting with nerves, because each time the lawyer read out a name followed by a small piece of inheritance, a painting here, a car there, a sum of money, it was met with shallow nods and satisfied smiles, but none of it reached her, and she could feel the eyes around the table glancing her way as if to remind her she would not be mentioned at all. The suspense grew thicker as the lawyer moved further down the pages, his calm tone unbroken, while the laughter and whispers faded into silence, because everyone was waiting for the real treasures, the grand estate, the businesses, the wealth that would secure power for generations. Amara's pulse hammered in her ears, so loud she could barely hear the words, until suddenly the lawyer paused, adjusted his glasses, and with a firm voice declared, "The entirety of the estate, including all assets, properties, and holdings, shall be passed on to my granddaughter, Amara." For a moment, the world seemed to stop moving, and in that stillness Amara could hardly breathe, her name echoing in her mind like a bell rung in the distance, impossible yet undeniable. The room, once filled with smug certainty, erupted in shocked gasps, chairs scraping against the polished floor as relatives sat up straight, their faces drained of confidence, replaced with disbelief, anger, and confusion. The same mouths that had mocked her were now frozen open, the same eyes that had looked down on her now wide with astonishment, and Amara, who had sat so quietly at the far end of the table, suddenly became the center of every gaze. Her heart pounded wildly, her fingers numb as she tried to process the words, wondering if she had misheard, but the lawyer repeated them clearly, sealing the truth that could not be undone. The estate, the businesses, the legacy of her grandfather, all of it was hers. The silence that followed was heavier than the mockery that had filled the room before, a silence that demanded an answer but offered none, because no one knew what to say, and Amara herself was caught between disbelief and awe. She remembered her grandfather's kind eyes, his voice telling her she was strong, and in that moment she understood why he had chosen her, why he had looked past the sneers of others and trusted her to carry his name forward. The relatives shifted uncomfortably, some shaking their heads, some whispering in harsh tones, but none of their words could change what was written on the paper in front of the lawyer. Suspense lingered in every corner of the room, the weight of unspoken questions pressing on all of them. How could this be? Why her? What did it mean? And as Amara sat frozen in her chair, she realized that everything she thought about herself, every doubt planted by their cruelty, had just been turned upside down. She was no longer the outsider, no longer the shadow at the table, she was the heir, the one who had inherited everything, and the room that once made her small now seemed to shrink around those who had mocked her, leaving her in the light of a truth that none of them could deny. Amara sat frozen long after the lawyer's voice faded, the words still echoing inside her head like a secret too heavy to carry, and as the room erupted in restless murmurs and sharp whispers, she realized with growing unease that her life had changed in a single breath. The very people who had mocked her only minutes ago now shifted in their seats, their earlier laughter replaced by forced politeness and hungry stares, as though they were already scheming how to twist her new position to their advantage. She could feel their eyes burning into her, measuring her not as family but as the sudden gatekeeper to the wealth they believed belonged to them, and the weight of that gaze pressed harder on her shoulders than their earlier insults had. At first there was shock, then anger, then a dangerous kind of silence, the kind that hinted at plans forming behind tight lips. Amara lowered her eyes, her mind racing, because though the idea of owning everything sounded powerful, in reality it terrified her. The estate was more than land and money, it was a name, a legacy built by her grandfather's hard work, and now all of it rested on her shoulders, a teenager who had never expected to carry such a burden. The lawyer's calm tone could not soften the storm brewing around her, and though he continued reading the final notes of the will, no one truly listened, not even Amara, because all she could hear was the sound of her heart pounding against the responsibility suddenly laid at her feet. She thought of her grandfather's hands, worn yet steady, the way he had guided her through his garden and told her that real strength came from patience and courage, not from wealth, and she realized that he had not left her this inheritance to flaunt but to protect and grow. The thought both comforted and frightened her, because she knew she would have to face the same people who had tried to shame her, not with anger but with resolve. Around the table, the relatives' faces hardened, some whispered to each other, their eyes darting in her direction, while others looked at her with thin smiles that did not reach their eyes, and Amara felt an icy chill run down her spine. They would not accept this easily, she knew, they would question, protest, perhaps even fight to take what was now hers, and the weight of that truth made her hands tremble under the table. Yet somewhere in the midst of her fear, there was a quiet clarity, a reminder of why her grandfather had chosen her. He had seen her not as weak or small, but as someone who could endure, who could rise when others doubted. That trust was a burden heavier than gold, and Amara realized that to honor him, she would need to find strength inside herself that she had never used before. The grand hall suddenly felt smaller, the walls pressing in with unspoken demands, and though she wanted to shrink into her chair and disappear, she forced herself to sit tall, not because she felt brave, but because she knew she could not let them see her break. The suspense in the air was thick, every second stretching like a thread ready to snap, and Amara wondered what would happen when they left this room, when the papers were signed, when the wealth was truly hers to carry. Would they turn on her? Would they plead with her? Would she even know how to make the right choices with what she had been given? The questions crowded her mind, each one heavier than the last, but deep beneath the storm of doubt, there was a spark of determination, the same spark her grandfather had nurtured in her. She could almost hear his voice again, steady and calm, telling her that the measure of an heir was not how much they inherited, but how wisely they carried the gift. The relatives might see her as unworthy, but she knew she had been chosen for a reason, and though the burden of legacy felt overwhelming now, it was also a path forward, one that would test her, shape her, and ultimately reveal who she truly was. In that moment, as the last lines of the will were read and the meeting came to an uneasy close, Amara understood that her journey was only beginning, and the suspense of what came next lingered like a shadow in the room, heavy with the weight of what she had to become. Amara left the hall with the will still echoing in her ears, her footsteps heavy on the stone floor as though each step carried the weight of an entire legacy, and though her relatives trailed behind her with eyes sharp and calculating, she held her head high, determined not to let them see the storm raging inside. Days turned into weeks, and the news of her inheritance spread beyond the estate walls, reaching neighbors, friends, and even strangers who looked at her with a mix of curiosity and awe, some praising her fortune while others whispered doubts about whether a teenager could handle such responsibility. At first, Amara felt lost in the endless meetings with lawyers, advisors, and bankers who spoke in complicated words, their tones polite but questioning, as if silently asking whether she truly deserved the seat she now held. Each paper she signed, each decision she made felt like stepping into a world too vast for her, yet she refused to back down, clinging to the memory of her grandfather's steady voice telling her she was stronger than she believed. Suspense surrounded her every move, for she knew that behind the polished smiles of some relatives there were plans to challenge her, to twist the situation back in their favor, and she could sense the tension building like a storm waiting to break. But instead of folding under the pressure, Amara began to study, to learn, to listen carefully to those who wished her well and to filter out the voices of greed disguised as advice. She spent long nights walking through the quiet estate, running her hands over the walls and gardens her grandfather had loved, whispering to herself that this was not just about wealth, it was about carrying forward his vision, about creating something meaningful with what he had left behind. Slowly, she began to shape her role, making choices that surprised everyone. Instead of hoarding the riches, she directed funds toward building scholarships for students like her, opening community centers where young people could learn and grow, and restoring parts of the estate to serve the public rather than remain locked behind iron gates. The same girl who had once been mocked at the table now stood before crowds, her voice steady as she announced programs that gave hope to families who had none, her heart swelling each time she saw gratitude in their eyes. Still, the suspense never faded completely, for her relatives hovered in the background, some bitter, some resentful, and Amara knew that envy had a way of rising when least expected, but she no longer faced them with silence or fear. She had discovered her own strength, not loud or forceful, but steady and unshakable, the kind of strength that grows from pain endured and lessons learned. Every decision she made reminded her of her grandfather's trust, and though the burden had once felt unbearable, it had transformed her into someone she herself barely recognized, the outsider who had become a leader, the humiliated girl who had become a symbol of resilience. The suspense of what the future would bring still lingered like a shadow, but Amara embraced it now, knowing that every challenge ahead was another chance to prove her worth. She had inherited more than wealth, she had inherited the courage to rise above doubt, the compassion to lift others with her, and the vision to turn mockery into legacy. And so, the transformation was complete, not in the gold or the land she now owned, but in the steady fire within her heart, a fire that would keep burning long after the whispers and laughter of that day were forgotten.